strong and mighty, Yahweh, this place.
Hi, and welcome to Passion for Truth Ministries. I'm Jim Staley. Today we have an exciting subject. I get an enormous amount of emails and a lot of phone calls, and people have been asking me to do this teaching for 6 years now plus. So every year I say I'm going to get around and do this teaching, but this is the year to teach on the Sabbath. So for whatever reason, the Lord is having me do this, and I'm excited about it. We're going to work through a lot of scriptures. We're going to determine at the end of this study what the Sabbath is, what it means for us today, and how do we keep it if we're supposed to keep it. So let's get started today. Talking about the Sabbath and work through the scriptures and see what they have to say. First of all, there are several questions that we'll need to answer. Number one is, does God even care? Does He care about the Sabbath whatsoever? Number two, who is it given to? Number three, why was it given and how long was it to be given for? We'll also be talking about several myths about the Sabbath. Number one, what is the prophetic symbolism? We'll also be talking about that. Why don't we keep the Sabbath of the Bible today, and was it really changed? And then if it is for today, how do we keep it? I know that many of you will be thinking to yourself, you already have, some of you Bible students already have verses in your head in the New Testament that you're familiar with that seem to say that the Sabbath is done away with, that we don't have to keep it, that it's not relevant for today, that it was only for the Old Testament or for the New Testament Jews. So I'm going to bring these up right away so you know that we're actually going to cover every single one of those. So if we could go back to the screen, one of the ones we're going to cover is Colossians chapter 2, verse 16 says, "Let no one judge you for food or drink, new moons or Sabbath." We're going to talk about that. Romans 14:6 we'll talk about, "Whoever observes the day, observes it for the Lord." 1 Corinthians 16:1 we'll talk about, where Paul takes up a collection for the saints in Jerusalem on the first day of the week. And in Acts chapter 20, verse 7, where Paul's preaching on the first day of the week. A couple other ones we'll be talking about is Revelation 1:10, when John had a vision on, quote, the Lord's Day. We'll find out exactly what the Lord's Day is, and is it referring to Sunday. And then also, lastly, Galatians 4, where Paul talks about not going back to the elementary principles of the world. So what we want to talk about is, we're going to find out, first of all, does God even care about the Sabbath whatsoever? So before we can go any further, it's a relevant question to answer, because if He doesn't care, if the Creator of the universe, Yahweh, does not care about the Sabbath, then we don't need to go any further in our study. So we're going to determine that right up front. He says in Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, he says, "For in 6 days Yahweh made heaven and earth." And every time you see L-O-R-D in capital letters in your Bible, that is the actual tetragrammaton, or the Hebrew proper name for Yahweh, Yod-He-Vav-He. So you'll hear me say Yahweh whenever we read L-O-R-D, because that's what it actually says in the Hebrew. "For in 6 days Yahweh made heaven and earth, the sea and all that's in them, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore Yahweh blessed the seventh day," or the Sabbath day, "and hallowed it." So one of the very first things that we're going to be talking about, if he says, to answer the question, does He care, is right here in Exodus we find that He gives a commandment. So it's really almost a silly question, although we're going to work through it, we're going to get the answer to it, to ask the question, does He care about something that He said is a commandment, is like me telling one of my 5 daughters to clean your room on Thursday night and have them ask, well, does Daddy really even care if we clean it at all? And so I want to propose and submit that to you, that really even asking the question is really a strange question, because He's the potter, we are the clay. If He says to do something, then we should do it and not ask why, or if He really meant it. Because ultimately, isn't that what the enemy said in the garden? The serpent said, He didn't really mean for you to do that. You won't really die. There's always asking the question. But for the sake of argument, we're going to work through this. Back to the beginning. Acts chapter 3, verse 20 says this, and that He may send Yeshua the Messiah, what's His Hebrew name is Yeshua, who was preached to you before, whom heaven must receive until the times of restoration of all things, which God has spoken by the mouth of His holy prophets since the world began. And at what point on the timeline do you think he'll be restoring all things? Because listen, we have a very Greek mentality. We have a timeline that starts over here and ends over here. And so when we have to ask the question, when we come to Acts chapter 3, verse 20, when it says that at the end of time, he's going to restore all things. Well, at what point on this timeline is he going to restore all things? Is it going to be in the 21st century, sometime in the 21st century, sometime in the 20th century? Is he going to restore it to the times of the first century? Or is he going to restore it all the way back to when he said it was very good? Let's keep asking some serious questions here. Number one, can we agree that when our Creator made the heavens and the earth, that there were no flaws and that he made all things perfect? Number two, can we agree that everything that he made in the garden was perfect and he never intended or desired for anything to change for all eternity? And number three, would you agree with me that if Adam had not sinned, everything that was said to be very good would still be perfect and unchanged? Number four, would you agree with me that in the beginning all things were perfect, as we just established? Then Adam sinned, sent the world into a tailspin of constant groaning and imperfection. It says the whole world is groaning. But at some point in the future, when the Messiah comes back, he will restore all things back to the original state of perfection. And so we are going to answer these very serious questions because ultimately, we all deserve that these questions to be asked and for every single one of them to be answered. If we move to Genesis chapter 2, we're going to find out that the motivation of God, the motivation of Yahweh is everything. On the seventh day, God ended his work which he had made. He rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. And this is Genesis chapter 2. So not even into the 2 verses into the second chapter of the Bible, we are talking about a verse that is setting something apart. Matter of fact, the Hebrew word for set apart is kadosh, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So if he set apart the seventh day in the garden when everything was said to be perfect, and it was never his intention for anything to ever change from that perfection, and the scriptures tell us that he is going to restore all things back to the beginning. Think about this. Isn't it logical to assume that the Sabbath on the seventh day was never intended to change? It was never intended to change. If he created Adam and Eve perfect, and he created the earth perfect, and all the animals perfect, and he created the sun, the moon, the stars, and the heavens perfect, and when he finished everything and rested on the seventh day, and he said, I hallow it, I set it apart, I make it completely different than all the rest of the days, I am making it holy. Just like he sets us apart and makes us holy from the rest of the world. We're not like the rest of the world. We are set apart. The same exact word that's used in Genesis 2:2. We as believers are that exact same word. We are consecrated and dedicated, sanctified and set apart. And that's what he's doing all the way back in the garden. So the point is this: if he sets it apart in the garden before they sinned, then isn't it very logical to assume that Yahweh's entire intent and desire is for it to never, ever have changed? Let's go back to the restoration of the Sabbath when Yeshua comes back. I mean, let's find out if this is true. If it's true in the garden, it has to be true for all time. In Isaiah 66:22, it says this: For as the new heavens and the new earth, which I will make, shall remain before me, says Yahweh, so shall your seed and your name remain. In verse 23, and it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, says Yahweh. Now, the reason why this is so critical of a verse in Isaiah 66 is because this is when the Messiah is coming back. This is literally in the Messianic reign. This is the 1,000-year millennial reign of the Messiah. And during the millennial reign of the Messiah, he says right here that from one new moon to another and from one Sabbath to another, all flesh will worship him. So the question is begging, why would he even mention the word Sabbath or Shabbat in Hebrew here, if there's no intention of the Sabbath being set apart or being holy. Zechariah 14 verse 16 says this, "And it shall come to pass that everyone that is left on the nations," now setting this up here real quick before we go back to it, is that Yeshua has just landed on the Mount of Olives, split it in two. Okay? So we are literally at the Day of Trumpets, the fall festivals where the Messiah comes back. He lands on the Mount of Olives and he is beginning his millennial reign in Jerusalem. That's where Zechariah 14 is picking up. Verse 16, it says this, "And it shall come to pass that every one that is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall even go up from year to year to worship the King," Yeshua, "Yahweh of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles." Keeping the Feast of Tabernacles in the millennium as well. "And it shall be that whoso will not come up of all the families of the earth unto Jerusalem to worship the King, Yahweh of hosts, even upon them shall be no rain." So we are seeing not only in Isaiah that we are going to be keeping the Shabbat, what's called the Shabbat or the Sabbath, the seventh-day Sabbath, but right here in the millennium in Zechariah 14, we have a more than a hint, more than a clue. We have a direct command that all of the nations of the world must come up for the Feast of Tabernacles, and they must honor the Lord's Sabbath. And this is the importance of this is because we see this in the garden, and the logic says that he never intended for it to go away to begin with. We see this in the end. We see this in the millennium, which goes on for 1,000 years. The only question of time that we're asking about is right now, in between those two moments of time. And that's what we're going to find out today by searching the Scriptures. Because ultimately, this is what we have. If we believe that the Sabbath is not for today, then we have this strange paradox. Because from 4000 BC to the time of Yeshua, Yahweh cares. God cares. Then from 30 AD to the present day, he doesn't care. And then when Yeshua comes back for the next 1,000 years, he cares again. So he cares, he doesn't care, and now he cares again. And so we have to determine, is this logical? Is this a logical God that says, I don't change, I will never change, I'm a God who is a jealous God, I want you to worship me and do it my way, and I want you to use faith, and I will give you the faith as I send my Spirit to help you. But is it logical for him to make a law, says it's eternal, repeal it, and then bring it back? Or could it possibly be that we've misunderstood this part? Let's see. Bottom line is this. He cared in the garden. He cares when his son comes back. He says that the seventh-day Sabbath is forever. It's logical to assume that he still cares. But we're going to test this theory and find out if it actually holds water in the next 30, 40 minutes. So some common myths about the Sabbath. Number one of the most common myths by far that people email me or they'll talk to me about is, Jim, the Sabbath was given only to the Jews. We'll talk about that. They also say that it's the Christian Sabbath is on Sunday. The Jewish Sabbath is on Saturday. I just had someone last week, even in my own family, that said, Jim, the Sabbath, the Jewish Sabbath is on Saturday, but the Christian Sabbath is on Sunday. Well, we have a major scriptural problem with that because that's two laws. One for the Jew, one for the Gentile, when we don't have time to go into it, but in Deuteronomy it says that I will have one law for the Jew and the Gentile. One people, one law, one God, one Messiah, one land. Number three. Most common myths about the Sabbath is it ended at the cross and was not reestablished in the New Testament. Number four, Paul taught against the Sabbath. We're going to find out whether that's true or not as well. And also the New Testament church kept the Sabbath on Sunday. And that is very, very common. So let's start off with myth number one. It was only given to the Jews. First of all, we need to determine where did the term Jew even come from. Well, it's very important to understand this before we go any further, because this is probably by far one of the biggest misconceptions of the entire Bible, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it a little bit later, is that there is the Old Testament, which is for the Jews, and the New Testament is for the Christians. Well, it's very important to remember that the word Jew comes from the term Judah, which is the tribe of Judah. And it's also not only the tribe of Judah, but it's also the southern kingdom. You have the northern kingdom, which was called the house of Israel, and the southern kingdom, which was called the house of Judah. Over time, eventually, the house of Judah became known as, the Jews. And so that's why we have Jews today, is because the Jews came back from captivity in for 70 years in Babylon back in 586 BC, where the northern kingdom never came back. They assimilated into the nation. So today the word Jew can mean Israel, but Israel of the Bible is all 12 tribes. So matter of fact, in that line of thinking, how many tribes of Israel were present at the base of Mount Sinai when the commandments were given? This is really important, because if we say that the Sabbath was only given to the Jews, then what we're saying is that the only tribe, the only kingdom that was at the base of Mount Sinai was the house of Judah, or Judah themselves. There had to be no other tribes at the base of Mount Sinai if it was only given to the Jews, because that's what the term Jew means. Okay? There were 12 tribes at the base of Mount Sinai. All 12 of them were there. So clearly, he did not give it only to the Jews. He gave it to all of the sons of Jacob, Yaakov, or Israel. And that's the biblical answer to who did he actually give it to. He gave it to all the sons of Israel. The third question that we need to ask is this: how many would end up being considered Jewish? And we just answered this, that there was the southern kingdom that ended up being Jewish, which ended up being comprised of Judah, Benjamin, and a little bit of Levi. So that, if you were in the southern kingdom, eventually you became Judah, or Jewish. All the rest of them were from the northern kingdom: Asher, Dan, Naphtali. All of those are not Jewish. So if you're from the north, if there were such thing as a Danite today, they would be called a Danite. They would not be called Jewish. Even if they kept the Sabbath, all the feast days, and the entire Torah, they could not be called Jewish because they're not from the southern kingdom. They were from the northern kingdom. If anything, they'd be called a Ephraimite, or an Israelite, a Hebrew. That would be probably a more biblical, accurate explanation of those that are from the northern kingdom. And so what was the purpose of Israel? Isaiah 42:6. This is really important. I, Yahweh, have called you in righteousness, and will hold your hand. I will keep you and give you as a covenant to the people, as a light to the Gentiles. Does that sound familiar? Because in Matthew chapter 5, Yeshua says the very same thing. He says, I am the light to the nations. And then he turns to his disciples and he says, now you are the light to the world. You see, that wasn't just a brilliant stroke of genius that he came up with. He's literally keeping the same message that he had from the very beginning of time, all the way till the time where he gives these instructions. It's the same instructions that his father gave Israel to begin with, is that I want you to be a light to the nations. Now think about this for just a moment. If Israel is a light, that means that there are people in darkness. And so what happens if people are in darkness and they can't see, and you see a light? Picture yourself in your dark bedroom and you get up in the middle of the night. What is normally the very first thing that you're going to gravitate towards so that you can not bump into the walls? You're going to find the first light. Your eyes are going to be attracted and gravitate towards light, because where there is light, you can see. And so that is the whole illustration that God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is trying to get across to his people, is that I have given you the truth, which is my light, which David says many times in the Psalms and throughout the Scriptures, that his truth is light, and a light unto my path, right? And he says, they are in darkness. I want you to take my truth, keep it so that I can bless you, so that they will be attracted to the light, and then they can join you. And that was the whole concept in Exodus when the Israelites left Egypt, and some of the mixed multitude came from the Egyptians. Some of the smart Egyptians defected from the army, and they said, you know what, their God's a little bigger than our God. I think I'll follow their God. And they defected, and they came with the Israelites, and Moses came to Yahweh and said, what are we going to do here? They're not native born. What should we do? And Yahweh said, absolutely allow them in. This is the first time we see grafted in happening in the Bible that we come to later in Romans chapter 11, where he says, let them be grafted in and let them be as native-born Israelites. The only thing I'm going to require of them is this, and it's the same thing, by the way, in Acts chapter 15, which we'll address a little bit later. Same halakhic decision. He says, have them be circumcised and have them keep my commandments, and they will be no different than any of my children. Okay? And so that's really important for us to understand right up front, that the purpose of Israel was to be a light to the nations. Unfortunately, they didn't do their job. So the Father had to send his Son down here to teach us how to do our job. Deuteronomy chapter 4 says, I have taught you decrees and laws as the Lord my God commanded me, so that you may follow them in the land you are entering to take possession of it. Observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations, who will hear about all these decrees and say, surely this nation is a wise and understanding people. What other nation is so great as to have their gods near them the way Yahweh our God is near us whenever we pray to him? And what other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws I'm setting before you this day? So think about this. We have the Great Commission idea in Christianity where we spend millions of dollars and we go out and we tell everybody about Jesus and you got to do this and you got to do that. And we try our best with most creative ways of audio, visual, and pamphlets and little tracts and videos and all of these things to try to get people to see the gospel, to try to make it the most attractive thing possible. But the very first Great Commission was this. It was, keep my commandments, and I will bless you so much that the nations will come to you. You won't have to go to them because they will see that they're in the dark, that they're not being blessed, that you're the ones that have rain on your land, that you're the ones that are not hungry, that you're the ones that are being blessed in every way known to man, and they're going to come and find out that what an incredible God that you have that has such amazing and marvelous decrees and statutes. Tell us about your God. Now, wouldn't it be nice if you had people knocking on your door asking you, tell us, how are you doing it? How are you so blessed? Why are you so happy? Why are your marriage so happy? Why are your kids so good? And you have the opportunity to tell them. See, I'm going to suggest to you that one of the biggest problems that we have in religious Christian circles today is that there's not enough meat on the bones. There's not enough of a growth in the garden, if you will. There's not enough life coming out of the life for that people can see the life and desire it. We have so many things that we offer them, and they see right through it, and they see dead bones. They see walking dead people, if you will. And I believe the Father wants to resurrect the bones and put the flesh and the sinews back on so that we can absolutely have life flowing out of us like a river that brings life to the nations. This is an interesting slide. Gentiles encouraged to keep the Sabbath in the Old Testament? This is one of the number one scriptures that people bring up, or number one concepts that people bring up, and they say, Jim, nowhere in the Bible does God tell Gentiles that they have to keep the Sabbath. And I say, really? Isaiah 56, let's see what it says. Also the sons of the stranger, Goyim, the Gentiles, and the sons of the Gentiles that join themselves to the Lord, to serve him and to love the name of Yahweh, to be his servants, every one that keeps the Sabbath from polluting it, and taketh hold of my covenant. Even them will I bring to my holy mountain, and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be accepted upon my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations. Do you hear what the great God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is saying right here? He is saying that even the Gentiles, if they come, if is the key word, I-F, if they come and they keep my Sabbath and they keep from profaning it, I will accept them as my own people. And the key word there is if. Two important things he's saying in the scripture. First of all, he allows the Gentiles to come in and be his people. Number two, he puts a condition on it. You will be my people if you do what I tell you to do. It's no different than a father that tells his son that's 17 years old, that's kind of talking back, and he says, son, if you want to live in this house, you can finish the rest of it. You're going to play by my rules. You see, it works on earth. It works in every workplace. You can't just walk into a workplace and look at the rules as they train you on your first day and say, you know what, I'm going to choose this rule, but I don't really like this rule. I think I'm going to leave at 3 o'clock instead of 5:30. It doesn't work like that, or you don't stay very long. And I'm going to suggest that we have turned God from Creator Yahweh into our friend and buddy, where we have the choice to choose to serve Him when and how we want. Let's continue. We have one law for both. Exodus 12:49 says this, one law shall be for him that is homeborn, and unto the stranger that sojourns among you. So there's one law for us, and there's the same law for the Jews. The same law for all of Israel. See, doesn't that make a lot more sense that He has one law for one people, one nation, under God, indivisible, and with liberties and so on and so forth, in one land, under one king? It's all about one. The second you split it, we have issues. So here's the game plan. This is an illustration that I give quite a bit because I think it seems to help people understand what the purpose of Israel was. Think of Israel as a football team, and they are the captains of the team. So Yahweh wanted to get a team together, because all of the teams went their own way and they didn't want to play in His stadium anymore. So finally He had to choose someone to get back into the stadium so that He could begin to bring the people back in one place. Because they're all their own stadiums and He wants them in His stadium and to play on His field. So He chose the Israelites to be the captains of the team. Their job was to do this. Their job was to do what the owner of the team told them to do. To practice the way that the owner told them to practice, and to play the way that the owner told them to play. And if they did that, this would result in the team being so blessed that all of the other players from all the other teams would quit their teams, stop playing in their stadiums, which He didn't build, and they would come back to Yahweh's stadium. They would play on His team. They would beg to be on His team. Their light, quote, was supposed to show them the way. The light coming out of the stadiums would be so amazing that they would say, man, we don't even have light in our stadium. We can only play during the day. And they would come and be able to play on His turf, His way, and be blessed by His rules. Bottom line, the Sabbath was given to the whole world in Genesis chapter 2 when everything was perfect and when clearly it was intended to be for all time. It was written down on Mount Sinai and given to all of the children of Israel, not just one, but all 12 tribes, with the intent for them to keep it and thus be a light for the nations. And it's not a Jewish Sabbath. So dispelling myth number one, very clearly, it is not a Jewish Sabbath. It says that it is the Sabbath of Yahweh. So if it was given to the Israelites and through them the nations, then the next logical question is, who are we? If it was given to the Israelites and not to the Jews, you might say, well, Jim, I'm a Gentile. I'm not an Israelite at all. I'm not a Jew, and I'm not from any Middle Eastern descent or so on. I'm just an American Christian. How does this relate to me? Well, let's find out. In Jeremiah chapter 11, verse 16, one of the most popular chapters in all of the New Testament, it says this. It says, the Yahweh called thy name, a green olive tree, fair and of goodly fruit. So right here in Jeremiah chapter 11, and this is a verse that is not very well known. Now, the one that I was talking about was Romans 11, which is very popular, but Romans 11 is attached to Jeremiah 11. You cannot get into Romans 11 without first understanding what's happening in Jeremiah 11 is that Yahweh calls His bride, His people, the chosen people, an olive tree. Very critical if we're going to understand who we are and how this all relates to the Sabbath. Ephesians chapter 2 says, remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, the Messiah, excluded from citizenship in Israel. Excluded, meaning they're not allowed to be part of Israel. And foreigners or Gentiles to the covenants of the promise. Covenants with an S, by the way. Without hope and without God in the world. But now in Yeshua the Messiah, You who were once far away have been brought near through the blood of Christ. So you hear what's happening here is, first of all, he says that you once were far off. You were not allowed to be a citizen of Israel. You could not even be part of her covenants. Do you realize that the writer of Ephesians is putting value in the covenants of promise? Because he's saying that you were not allowed to have this blessing. You were not even allowed to be a part of it. But let's keep reading. He says, therefore, going back to Exodus 31, it says, therefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the 7th day he rested and he was refreshed. So think about it this way. First of all, Jeremiah 11 says that Israel is an olive tree. Ephesians 2 says, you who were once far off have now been brought near, and you've been made fellow citizens with the household of God. Romans 11 talks about being grafted in. It says what? There's 2 olive trees. Okay? 2 olive trees, and the wild olive tree gets grafted back into the cultivated olive tree, and let's substitute the correct word in Jeremiah 11, gets cultivated back into Israel. So these Gentiles actually are no longer Gentiles. Do you realize, viewer, that the word Gentile means out of covenant? So if you consider yourself a Gentile Christian, what you're really saying is you're an out-of-covenant Christian, and that's an oxymoron. You can't have that. Either you are in covenant and you're part of the Messiah, or you're out of covenant and you will spend eternity away from him. So